The metal of the clippers feels like ice against the inflamed skin of her scalp. It is a specific vibrating violence that drowns out the low murmur of the holding pen. She does not look up at the American GI holding the device. She only looks down at the mud where her braids, unwashed for 6 weeks and stiff with grease, fall in clumps. They land on top of the boots of the woman who went before her. There is a smell here that defies language, a thick, sweet rot of sweat, damp wool, and the chemical sting of DDT powder pumping into the air like white smoke. For 18 months, her body has been a host. The lice, die Kleiderläuse, have colonized the seams of her gray uniform, burrowing so deep they feel like a second skin. But now, as the razor strips her bare, the shame is colder than the wind sweeping off the Rhine. She is no longer a signal auxiliary, a sister, or a daughter. In this moment, stripped and shorn under the glare of a generator-powered bulb, she is simply biological matter to be disinfected. The mud hell of the Rhine. To understand the lice, you must first understand the mud. In the spring of 1945, the structured world of the German military did not just end, it dissolved into liquid earth. As the Wehrmacht collapsed, millions of soldiers and thousands of female auxiliaries, Wehrmachthelferinnen, were herded into the Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps. These were not camps in the traditional sense of barracks and fences. They were simply open fields enclosed by barbed wire, stretching along the flat, wind-swept banks of the river. There was no shelter. There were no latrines. There was only the rain, which fell incessantly in those first weeks of peace, turning the grassy meadows into a quagmire of slurry that reached the knees. For a woman who had spent the war in a clean uniform, typing transcripts or operating a telephone switchboard in Paris or Berlin, the physical shock was absolute. She stood in the open, day and night. To sleep, she had to curl up in the mud, pressing her body against strangers for warmth. The ingenuity of desperation took over quickly. With no shovels, prisoners used their hands, tin cans, or stolen spoons to dig Erdhöhlen, earth holes. These were shallow graves for the living, burrowed into the sodden ground to escape the biting wind. A woman might spend 12 hours a day huddled in a hole 3 feet deep, a piece of tarp or a coat thrown over the top, praying the sides wouldn't collapse and suffocate her in her sleep. This misery was bureaucratic by design. The Americans classified these captives not as prisoners of war, POWs, which would have guaranteed them Red Cross packages and Geneva Convention calorie standards, but as Disarmed Enemy Forces, DEF. This legal linguistic trick stripped them of rights. It meant the 2,000 calories a day required by international law became a theoretical concept. In reality, the rations in the cages often dropped below 1,000, sometimes below 700. It was a starvation diet administered in a sea of mud, creating a biological environment where the human immune system simply stopped working. The logistics of lice and the collapse of soap. Before the mud, there was the golden cage. For years, many of these women, known colloquially as Blitzmädel because of the lightning bolt insignia on their uniforms, occupied a unique strata in the Third Reich. They were not combatants, but they were the nervous system of the Wehrmacht. They sat in heated bunkers in Norway or occupied French chateaus handling communications. They had access to hot water, French soap, and ration cards that guaranteed butter. Their war was clean. The shock of 1945 was the sudden total evaporation of hygiene. As the Allied lines advanced and the logistical spine of Germany snapped, the water stopped running. In the chaos of the retreat, soap became more valuable than Reichslarks. By the time they reached the holding camps, many had not bathed in weeks. In the Rheinwiesenlager, the water crisis was existential. In some enclosures, there was a single standpipe for 10,000 people. The queue for water could last 6 hours. By the time a woman reached the front, clutching a rusted tin can or a Wehrmacht helmet to catch the trickle, the water was often shut off. There was no water for drinking, let alone for washing clothes. This was the environment the louse had been waiting for. Die Kleiderläuse, body lice, are biological opportunists. Unlike head lice, which live on the scalp, body lice live in the seams of clothing, moving to the skin only to feed. In the freezing damp of the open-air camps, prisoners wore every layer of clothing they possessed: 3 shirts, 2 wool sweaters, a greatcoat, never taking them off for fear of freezing to death or having them stolen. This created a permanent, dark, humid incubator between the fabric and the skin. The infestation began as a subtle irritation, a phantom tickle along the waistband or under the armpit. Within days, it became a roaring torment. A single female louse can lay 10 eggs a day in the seams of a wool tunic. In the crowded earth holes where bodies were pressed together like sardines, the lice migrated freely from host to host. The psychological toll was distinct from the hunger. Hunger is a dull ache, a hollowing out. The lice were active, aggressive invaders. They denied the women dignity. To be covered in vermin was to be reduced to the status of an animal, and riding on the back of the louse was the specter of typhus, the camp fever. It started with a headache, then a rash, then delirium. In the camps, where the ground was already contaminated with dysentery, the louse was not just a nuisance, it was a vector of death. The women learned to listen to their own bodies with terrified precision. Is that an itch, or is that the fever starting? The hygiene crisis. Blood and chitin. For the women in the enclosures, the collapse of civilization was marked not by the fall of Berlin, but by the first day of their cycle. In the Alltag, or everyday life, of the camp, menstruation was a logistical catastrophe. There were no sanitary napkins, no cotton wool, and certainly no privacy. When the bleeding started, it became a public shaming. Women tore the linings out of their greatcoats or ripped strips from their undershirts to create makeshift rags. These stiff, dirty pieces of wool or cotton had to be washed in the same freezing brown water used for drinking. Without soap, the blood never truly washed out. It just turned the fabric a dark, stiff gray. Women would hang these rags on the barbed wire to dry, flapping like grim flags of their biology, only to have them stolen or frozen solid by nightfall. The chafing against the inner thighs, raw from walking and cold, created open sores that refused to heal. Then there was the ritual of the Läusejagd, the louse hunt. It became the primary social activity of the camp. In the few hours of daylight, you would see circles of women sitting in the mud, shirts pulled off, focused with the intensity of diamond cutters. They ran their thumbnails along the inseams of their trousers. Knack, knack, knack. The sound of a louse being crushed between fingernails was distinct, a tiny dry pop. It was a sensory loop: the itch, the hunt, the pop, the smear of blood on the thumb. The lice were democratic. They did not care about rank. A former officer's wife and a farm girl would sit knee to knee, engaged in the same primate grooming ritual. The bites were not just pinpricks, they were welts that burned. The lice preferred the warmest parts of the body: the armpits, the groin, the hollow of the back, areas already tender from sweat and friction. At night, the sound of thousands of people scratching created a low, rasping friction, a soundtrack of misery that overlaid the wind. The lice also dictated the final indignity: the haircut. The Americans, terrified of a typhus epidemic that could jump from the prisoners to the GIs, mandated the shearing. It wasn't a styling choice, it was a medical eviction. The shearing often happened in assembly line fashion. The sensation was physically shocking. The sudden absence of weight on the head, the vulnerability of the exposed neck. For a generation of women raised on the ideal of the Gretchenzopf, or braided hair, as a symbol of Germanic womanhood, the loss was akin to an amputation. They would run their hands over the stubble, weeping not for the war, but for the stranger they saw reflected in the puddles. They tied headscarves tight, trying to hold on to a silhouette that no longer existed. The material shock and the chocolate price. For the louse was the avatar of defeat. The American ration pack was the artifact of the conqueror. To the German women, starved on a diet of turnips and sawdust-filled Kommissbrot, or army bread, the material culture of the U.S. Army appeared as a hallucination. The shock was most visceral when it came to bread. The standard German loaf was dark, dense, and sour. The American bread, baked in industrial field kitchens and wrapped in wax paper, was a blinding, unnatural white. When a prisoner first held a slice of American white bread, the sensory confusion was immediate. It felt too light, like a sponge. It smelled of yeast and sugar. Many women, upon tasting it, wept or vomited. Their stomachs, shrunken and acclimated to coarse roughage, couldn't process the refined flour. They called it Kuchen, convinced the Americans were eating dessert with every meal. It was soft, lacking the resistance of real food. It felt like a transgression, a swallowing of the enemy's luxury. This abundance birthed a new economy within the wire. With the Reichsmark worthless, the only currency that mattered was the cigarette and the calorie. The women became masters of the book-it trick. A discarded number 10 American tin can, used for peaches or Spam, was a treasure. With a rusty nail, they would punch holes in the bottom, turn it upside down over a small fire of twigs, and create a hobo stove. It focused the meager heat, allowing them to boil water in a helmet. The metallic clang of spoon against tin became the dinner bell of the camps. But the most dangerous material exchange happened at the fence. Despite the strict non-fraternization orders, the ban on soldiers speaking to Germans, the biological drive overrode the regulations. This was the era of the chocolate girl. The transaction was brutal in its simplicity. A pair of nylon stockings, sheer, shimmering, impossibly delicate compared to the itching wool of the uniform, cost 1 hour of intimacy. A bar of Hershey's chocolate could buy silence. The smell of American tobacco, sweet, toasted Virginia leaf, hung around certain barracks like a perfume. For the Wehrmachthelferinnen, this was the fraternization paradox. To speak to an American was forbidden. To sleep with one was survival. The somatic experience of this was a jarring dissonance. The warmth of a soldier's jeep or a heated tent, the taste of real coffee, followed immediately by the cold walk back to the mud hole. They carried the scent of the enemy back with them, Old Spice, Lucky Strikes, and chewing gum, marking them as targets for the scorn of their fellow prisoners. The inspection, spread and cough. The turning point does not come with a handshake or a treaty signing. It comes inside a canvas tent marked with a red cross, where the smell of iodine is sharp enough to water the eyes. This is the medical inspection. For the prisoners, the tent is a portal to another dimension. Outside, the world is brown, wet, and freezing. Inside, under the roar of the petrol heaters, the air is hot, dry, and terrifyingly bright. The American medical staff wear white masks and rubber gloves. They look like spacemen. The order is barked in broken German. Ausziehen, alles. Take it off. Everything. The somatic experience of stripping in front of these well-fed men is agonizing. As the layers of wool and filth come off, the truth of the body is revealed. The women are not just thin, they are architectural. The skin is pulled tight over the pelvic girdle. The ribs are not just visible, they are sharp. There is no fat to hide behind. The cold air of the tent hits their skin, causing goose flesh that rises instantly. They wrap their arms around themselves, trying to cover breasts that have shriveled from malnutrition. The line moves with industrial efficiency. A GI with a clipboard doesn't look at their faces, he looks at their skin. He is checking for the telltale rash of typhus, the scabs of impetigo, the open sores of scurvy. Then comes the dusting. It is the decisive moment of interaction. The prisoner steps forward. The American soldier, often a teenager from Ohio or Texas who has never seen such degradation, wields the duster gun like a weapon. He pumps the plunger. Poof, poof. The cloud of DDT powder hits the groin first, a cold, chalky blast. Then the armpits, then down the back of the neck. The powder gets in the mouth, tasting metallic and bitter. It coats the eyelashes. For the woman, it is the ultimate invasion, standing naked, hands raised, being sprayed like livestock. But in the eyes of the GI, there is often a flicker of something else. Not hate, but a recoil. He steps back. He holds his breath. He is repulsed by the sheer, overwhelming smell of her neglect. In that moment, the distance between the victor and the vanquished is measured in soap. The taste of the victor. The white bread shock. The inspection ends not with a bullet, but with a slice of bread. As the woman steps out of the DDT cloud, coughing, pulling her lice-ridden tunic back over her powdered skin, a GI points to a crate near the tent flap. It is stacked with loaves of American garrison bread. He tears a chunk off and holds it out. The gesture is casual, almost bored. She hesitates. Nazi propaganda had painted these men as gangsters, as monsters, but the monster is holding food. Her hand shakes as she reaches for it. The first sensation is tactile confusion. The bread is impossibly soft. It yields under her thumb like a damp sponge. There is no hard crust to fight against, no grit of sawdust or filler. It feels engineered. She puts it in her mouth. The white bread shock is a physiological event. For a body running on the complex carbohydrates of turnips and the acidity of black bread, the refined white flour and sugar of American rations hit the bloodstream like a narcotic. It dissolves on the tongue. It tastes overwhelmingly sweet, almost like cake. In memoirs, women recall this moment with a mix of ecstasy and nausea. One bite tells them more about the war than any radio broadcast. They realize that while Germany was boiling potato peels, the Americans had the industrial capacity to bake white, fluffy bread for millions of troops across an ocean. It is the taste of total logistical superiority. But the body often rebels. Minutes after swallowing, the cramps begin. The stomach, atrophied and stripped of its lining, spasms against the richness. Many women collapse outside the tent, clutching their bellies, vomiting the precious calories into the mud. The GI watches, confused. He thought he was giving a treat. He didn't realize he was feeding a fustum in collapse. This is the friction of the climax, the biological realization of defeat. The war is over not because the flag came down, but because the enemy has bread that melts in your mouth and your own body is too broken to keep it down. The somatic legacy. The body remembers. The camps eventually emptied, but the bodies did not forget. For the Wehrmachthelferinnen returning to a bombed-out Germany, the golden cage and the mud hell left permanent biological scars. The most widespread legacy was the silence of the womb. Amenorrhea, the cessation of menstruation due to starvation and stress, lasted for years for many women. The hunger winter of 1947, which followed their release, often meant that their calorie intake dropped even lower than in the camps. The female body, in a desperate bid to preserve vital organs, simply shut down the reproductive system. There was a pervasive, quiet terror among the returning women that they had been permanently sterilized by the chemicals in the American bread or the DDT powder. In reality, it was just the math of energy conservation. Then there was the hunger edema. Even after the war ended, women walked the streets with swollen bellies and ankles. It wasn't fat, it was fluid retention caused by a lack of protein. When they pressed a thumb into their shin, the indentation would stay for minutes, a phenomenon known as pitting. They looked simultaneously skeletal and bloated, a ghostly physiology that defied standard medical charts. The psychological somatic legacy was just as potent. For decades, women would wake up in the middle of the night, convinced they felt something crawling on their skin. The phantom itch was a neurological echo of the lice infestation. Even in clean beds with silk sheets and modern plumbing, the sensation of Kleiderläuse burrowing into the seams of a nightgown would return. It triggered a compulsive cleaning disorder. Grandmothers in the 1960s were observed boiling clothes that were already clean, driven by a deep-seated sensory memory that the water must be boiling to kill the eggs. The hair eventually grew back, but it grew back different. Many women reported that their new hair was gray or brittle, lacking the luster it had before the shearing. The short, bristly cut, which marked them as former prisoners, took months to grow out. During that transition, every time they looked in a mirror, they saw the inmate staring back. They wore hats and scarves not for fashion, but to hide the evidence of their processing. The data of survival, the calorie math. The somatic trauma was not just a feeling, it was a mathematical reality that could be measured in grams and kilocalories. History books often cite the official ration cards, but the biology tells the true story. In the winter of 1946-47, known as the Hunger Winter, the official ration in the British and American zones for a normal consumer was theoretically set to 1,550 calories. In reality, due to supply chain collapses, it frequently dropped to between 700 and 800 calories per day. To put this in perspective, a body at rest requires roughly 1,400 calories simply to keep the heart beating and the lungs inflating. These women were not at rest. They were clearing rubble, walking miles for water, and shivering in unheated ruins. The deficit was consumed directly from their own tissue. Medical reports at the time record an average weight loss of 30 to 40% among the female population. A woman who stood 5'6" might weigh less than 85 pounds. The statistics of release tell another part of the story. When they were finally issued their Entlassungsschein, a flimsy, typed slip of paper that was more valuable than gold, they did not return to normalcy. They entered a society where tuberculosis rates had spiked by 300%. The White Plague thrived in the weakened, lice-bitten bodies of the returnees. There is also the data of silence. In the immediate post-war years, the birth rate in Germany plummeted. While often attributed to the absence of men, the medical reality was that millions of women were physically incapable of conceiving. The POW body lingered long after the fences came down. It took nearly 5 years until a Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle of the early 1950s, for the average body weight of German women to return to pre-war standards. The 18 months of lice and hunger cast a shadow that stretched for half a decade. When we look at the history of 1945, we are seduced by the maps. We look at the red lines of the Allied advance, the black zones of occupation, the shifting borders of a broken Europe. But the history of the map is deceptive. It suggests that the war ended the moment the ink dried on the capitulation papers and rhymes. The history of the body tells a different, slower story, more painful. For the Wehrmachthelferinnen, the war did not end in May 1945. It continued in the phantom itch of a lice infestation that was no longer there. It continued in the cramps of a stomach learning to digest white flour again. It continued in the mirror, every morning, as a woman watched her hair grow back, millimeter by millimeter, reclaiming the femininity that the camps had sheared away. These somatic experiences, the smell of DDT, the texture of a rusted tin can, the biting cold of the Rhine mud, form an intimate archive. This archive is not stored in government filing cabinets, but in the nervous systems of a generation. The shame of the shorn head and the lice mother created a silence. These were not stories told at dinner tables during the economic miracle of the 1950s. They were memories scrubbed clean, just as the women had scrubbed their own skins. Yet these microhistories are the true fabric of the post-war world. The shock of American abundance, that first taste of soft, sweet bread, did more to align West Germany with the United States than any diplomat's speech. The biology of survival dictated the politics of the future. We leave these women not as they stand in the history books, as statistics or disarmed enemy forces, but as they stood in the mud, shivering, scratching, alive. Their bodies were the final battlefield of the Second World War, and their survival was its quietest victory.